Hey everyone, Phobos here, coming at you with another build guide, and this time it's for the Righteous Fire Chieftain that uses the Soul Mantle. Um, I already made a build demonstration where I covered a lot of the stuff, so unless you're looking to get into the really nitty gritty, you probably don't need to watch this video, but I'm just going to be going through everything in depth here and my choices, all my decision making, etc. So obviously we'll start at the top again with the Soul Mantle, and the reason why we decided to go Soul Mantle is because of the 50% increased totem life. Just gives an ass load of damage. Um, to put it in perspective, the best jewel you can possibly get for this build is Stonespire, and this is pretty much the best possible placement you can get for the jewel in the tree, and it only gives 30% totem life, and totems cannot be stunned, which is a big deal, but only 30% totem life. So the fact that Soul Mantle gives 50% increased totem life is just absolutely bonkers, and it makes the skill do a ton of damage. Just throw it in there in Path of Building, and you're going to see a dramatic difference in how much damage you can get out of the skill on totems. And the fact that it's been put to a level 20 spell totem, because previously it was like level 15. Now it's actually like viable to use with this build because it does the proper amount of damage, just baseline with a 20 spell totem. So pretty awesome there. Just to go over the links, I guess we'll do Conk Effect, which you swap out with increased AoE. Rapid Decay, which you can only use with Righteous Fire on totems because it's duration based. Righteous Fire, burning damage, Minion Totem Elemental, and Elemental Focus. Now, Minion Totem Elemental is the one that you drop, and running this on a 5-link isn't really a big deal at all because you still do insane damage, and this gem is really only about the damage because you don't need the totem resist at all because you end up getting totem life nodes, which also have resistance on them. I believe you get at least 3 nodes that give plus 16 to all res for your totems. I believe base totem resistance is like 35 now. So yeah, you're pretty much golden in terms of totem resistances without even taking this. This is just for the extra damage. You can also run reduced duration, but I believe it's like the same more. Um, so there's no point really in reducing the duration of your totems. Um, yeah, so that's pretty much the links, and I wanted to talk about burning damage for a second because this build was very viable in the previous league, or the 2. In patch 2.6. But what makes it so much better now is the burning damage support was changed to a more. So I think before it was like 75% increased, and now it's like 53% more, which is just retarded. So you do a lot of damage now, and that's why I kind of took a renewed interest in this build, basically, because I noticed people were playing a lot of Righteous Fire, and I kind of investigated. I was like, why are they doing that? It's hard to tell on beta because since everything has gotten nerfed, you're not really sure if people are playing like or you're not really sure if what's becoming meta is becoming meta because it's actually really strong, or if it's because it's like the next best thing to the shit that got absolutely wrecked by the 3.0 changes. So in this case, they just straight up buffed Righteous Fire because the burning damage support is insane now. So it's always good. And yeah, so I guess we can talk about next Kikazaru versus non-Kikazaru. So I think what really pushes it over the edge for me is the fact that these rings give the life regen, and this build is a very life regen centric build. If you look in the PoB that I'm going to link, the Path of Building sim stuff, once you hit around like level 92 to 95 and you have pretty much all your health, you're going to be having like around 6.4, 6.5k health, and your regen is going to be around like 900, which is absolutely insane. And these 2 rings pretty much account for like 180, 190 of that regen, right? Because you're going to be level presumably 90 or 95 and just double that because we're running 2 of the rings. So a huge amount of regen. The lightning res, obviously, always good to have. All the attributes roll, always good to have. Running the two of these together probably saves you a point in the tree because they pretty much make up like 30 decks. And the mana regen is great because you're using Mind Over Matter with your untapped into mana pool. And obviously the Curse effect duration allows you to not have to run a flash setup, which is a little bit awkward. So you can run a Quicksilver with movement. I mean, you can always run a Quicksilver with movement regardless, but this just makes it super easy to do that. So I really like it. And you can also use your, you just have room for more, like a lot more things on your flasks, basically. You don't have to worry about having curse immunity on like 2 flasks, right? Because that's kind of what I like to use if I'm not going to use the Kikizarus. I like to have long duration flasks with curse immunity as kind of like just a redundancy. And then those builds can also struggle quite mightily in stuff like Guardians or Breach Lords because the problem is that your duration on the flasks sort of times out, so you have to keep porting. Not always a huge deal, but it can be a pain in the ass, and using the Kikazara rings just completely skips over all those issues. On top of that, you're essentially curse immune, and I think the intuitive thought right away with the pairing of the Kikazara and the Soul Mantle is like, oh, well, since I'm using the Soul Mantle, I should use these Kikazara rings, and that's how I'm going to counter the effect of the Soul Mantle. And obviously that's true, but the thing that people don't realize about it is that, or about these rings, is that when you go into a map that would have really dangerous curses in it, like Vuln or possibly LE Weakness or something, or uh, there's tons of nasty curses, right? Temp Chains, super annoying curse. These rings get you out off the hook for free, which means that you can run maps with a ton of pack size on them because curses always come with the pack size rule. So it's just pretty much every bit of these rings is being used in like a very positive way with this build, right? You could say that stuff like life regen and attributes gets used in every build, and that would be true, but there are certain builds, like the Freezing Pulse build, the life regeneration really isn't as important because you're actually stacking a layer of energy shield on top of your life. So your life isn't even going to get damaged all the time. It's not like the life regen is bad, obviously, but in this build, it's focused around getting a ton of life regen. So pretty much every aspect of this ring is put to use. So awesome ring, in my opinion. For the gloves, pretty much just have standard resist gloves. Nothing really to see here. Same with the belt. Same with the boots. Now, the optimal boot enchant is probably going to be the 2% mana and life, 2% mana and life regen if you've been hit recently or something like that. All the damage enchants pretty much get wrecked because I don't think this applies to the Righteous Fire at all because it's burning and it's a very minimal amount of damage anyway. I'm like 90% sure there's nothing here that can be applied. And even the penetration one doesn't get applied because for penetration to take effect, you actually have to hit something and you're not ever hitting with Righteous Fire. So I think the best boon enchant is that defensive one with the life regen. You can also get stuff like there's a dodge one, I believe. But yeah, the one downside to this build is you're really getting kind of screwed with boot enchants, although the life regen one is very strong. So, and then this setup, so you can always go like dual Dorianis if you really want the damage. Like if you're doing something like a Breach Lord, and you have enough damage where you're gonna kill it very quickly, you can just kind of go in there with 2 Dorianis and do a ton of damage to it and kill the boss. But this setup is also not bad because right now we have 1 Dorianis and a shield with high fire damage. That's pretty much what you're looking for. All the other stats in this shield are kind of extra for sure. You don't need cast speed, obviously. You don't need crit. This just dropped like this. Obviously the life is good, so you're mostly looking for high fire damage, high life. And the base of the shield doesn't matter since it's spell damage, so. And the energy shield really doesn't matter either that much because you're not going to have a lot of energy shield this build, just point blank. Especially after the ES nerfs, that's the big problem, right? Now, the Hymnor's Resolve, you can use a normal helm for this if you like. If you get an enchant for Righteous Fire, then obviously your helm is probably going to be better than this helm, because this is like the only purpose of this helm really is 37% increased fire damage, and the cannot chill or be frozen if you used a fire skill recently, right? So it's not like you need this helm or anything like that. It's a good helm to start with, I'd say, before you have an enchant. But if you get like the damage enchant or something, you can always just replace it. Obviously, you can get the damage enchant on the helm, but that's obviously a lot harder. You might have to do that yourself, because I don't know how many people are bringing these helms into Uber Lab. And to be honest, you're probably better off not doing that, because you'd make more money just bringing other helms into Uber Lab and getting them enchanted, right? So yeah, probably not going to be a thing to get an enchant in this helm, but you can always try if you want. The one good thing about this helm, I would say, or well, one of the other good things about it is the high armor value, because you can actually sort of stack a bit of armor now, because you don't really need energy shield on your off pieces, because energy shield has been like reduced to such a drastic amount. We're not running discipline or anything, so you can like you don't have to use a hubris here, for example. You know, you don't have to use ES gloves here. It's nice to have probably one slot that's like ES, or at least partially ES, just for the fact that to make it easier to get your links for your Orb Storm setup, which is increased critical strikes, flammability, curse on hit, and Orb Storms. And obviously you change this to elemental weakness if you were to add another curse via the windscreen boots or something like that. But yeah, overall, you can pretty much just get armor pieces. Ideally, this would be like 300 armor gloves or something, right? But I just found these gloves cheap, and they had all the resistances and life, so might as well just pick those up. The amulet, nothing special at all. You can essence craft an amulet for fire damage, or you can use the Nagamahu's one. That one's also pretty good. It's like 60% fire damage, still has some res and life on it. So that's probably the best amulet for the build. But if you can't do that, you can also just essence craft one. You're basically just looking to hit a high life roll on any amulet you essence craft. Then you can throw some resist on there, or pretty much whatever else you want, but resist is going to be the main thing. You can always look for stuff like mana on boots as well, but then we're starting to get into that phase where you need a lot of stats on the item, because you're going to need a reasonable amount of resistances, unless you get lucky and get a ton on your shield or something. Because you're using a chest that doesn't have resistances and rings that only have one, and you're using a weapon that doesn't have any resistances, although that's not typical of a weapon anyway, having res, so you don't have like a ton of room for resists, but it's not like we're really struggling either. And when you compare it with the endurance charges and the fact that stuff like elemental weakness is going to be significantly reduced, you don't really need a ton of res, right? Because your elemental weakness isn't going to be cursing you and taking a ridiculous amount of your mana out, or your resistance out. So just something to keep in mind. And the more mana or the more armor you get on these pieces, basically, the more armor that your totems are going to have, thanks to War's Herald. And the more armor on you have is decent as well, because people really like to trash armor in this game, and I can completely understand why. But at the same time, if you have a little bit of armor, it kind of goes a long way, I feel like. You can also get, like on this granite, for example, you could have like on this basalt, you can have an armor effect on it. You can run a granite if you want. Use one health flask. There's a lot of different options you can go for here. So yeah, getting some armor is never bad. Helps you reduce those small hits. And it's going to do something to like moderate hits. The only time it's not really going to help is if you just get crushed by something insane. But you're going to have like the health and the minor mana pool for that, and tons of life regen. So, and the basalt, obviously. So, yeah, these flasks aren't really optimized. because it's kind of hard on beta. You end up just wasting a ton of alts, but they're reasonably fine right now. These are supposed to be better flasks, like divine flasks, an instant seething flask probably, for example, and then you can either run another health flask or another utility flask. The main flask you want, obviously, though, is Witchfire, because that's going to come in with your Jewel Curse, which we have right here, and your Flammability and your Witchfire. And the good thing about having a Witchfire, honestly, is that it ends up so that you don't have to even cast your Orb of Storms on trash. And you probably wouldn't really have to cast it on most trash anyways, but if you get some pretty resilient trash, um, it's still going to die very quickly because you have Vuln on it pretty much all the time. You're able to keep this up pretty much all the time. Um, so yeah, it's nice, really nice to have, and allows you to not have to, you don't even have to worry about getting Elemental Overload up on trash by using your Orb of Storms. It's mostly just a boss thing. But any big target or high HP rare, obviously, you want to make sure you're using your Orb of Storms on them, because your Orb of Storms is really the key that's going to allow you to do a ton of damage, because it procs Elemental Overload, first of all, and then it procs Elemental Equilibrium, which reduces their resistances by 50, which is pretty retarded, and you can just see basically, and it curses Flammability with this setup, so when you drop Orb on something, you can just see its health evaporate. It's quite hilarious. Um, yeah, so that's pretty much that. As far as the other setups, so I think that having a Scorching Ray totem is great. I'm not unsure if you should fully invest into it like this yet. The damage on Path of Building says that at 8 stacks, it's like 150k. So that's like reasonable damage. It's not terrible. It also says for some reason that the Searing Bond damage in this link is 300k. But I'm very skeptical about that because when I go over here, it says like 26k. So I don't understand, like, I'm going to have to look into this more and try and find out why the damage is so inflated on Path of Building. Because right now, this doesn't even seem worth running to me. Like, obviously, at first I thought it was worth running when I seen the PoB numbers, but when I'm looking at it now, it just looks kind of terrible, right? And it's not so much like, it's, in one sense it's free damage, but in another sense it's taking up link slots that we could be using for other things. So yeah, I don't really know about that one. Obviously you want your shield charge with Fortify. This is something to think about as well. So if you were to like remove this whole setup, you could maybe do something with like shield charge, Fortify. And actually no, because you would need to do like, yeah, you couldn't fit something out there. I was trying to think of something where you just curse on hit by shield charging into a pack, but then you couldn't have like faster attacks and Fortify. You could put probably Duration if you put this in like a 4-link instead. So obviously freeing up this group of slots is, or this 4-link right here is nice. And yeah, I'm just going to do a little bit more research, and I don't think I'm going to keep this Searing Bond totem in there for very much longer. We have a Rallying Cry, obviously, and a Flame Golem, and a Vol Lightning Trap. Vol Lightning Trap is great. Again, this is something, because of our links, we're kind of a bit weaker here, but if we had more links, like when we take this out, you ideally want to have Vol Lightning Trap and Rallying Cry in with increased duration, just so you don't have to use them as much. And then you have Flame Golem somewhere else entirely. You can always still use a Searing Bond, obviously, but it probably isn't going to be worth linking it to stuff, and it probably isn't worth using on its own, because then it'll just be super weak. So yeah, in terms of like the link management, there's still a little work to be done here. And you could also add like Arcane Surge to this setup with the Rallying Cry. Now obviously it's not going to give you more damage because it's more spell damage, but it is going to give you more mana regen. It's really just dependent on how many links you're going to have open after you take the stuff out, because if it's not going to be worth it if you have to take out other good gems essentially, right? Because I think it's like point something 0.2% of your max mana or something, or 2%. So it's not like a huge value of mana regen, but it's pretty good if you can get it, right? You always want more mana regen. The same thing with clarity. You can toss a clarity in here. Right now the links are tight, but once you take this out, they won't be as tight. So clarity is always good, and it doesn't eat up too much of your mana. It gives you a lot of mana regen. Yeah, just things to keep your mind over matter coming back up. You can also reserve stuff on your mana if you want. Like you can run a Vitality. Uh, the problem is I just find Vitality to be shit. If they eventually buff Vitality, like they're gonna do a balance patch pretty soon. They didn't mention anything about Vitality, but if they did buff Vitality, then that would be great because right now it's just in a really bad spot, and I don't feel like you're justified giving up 25% of your mana pool for the life regen. So just feels too weak to me. I think that's pretty much it with the gear. Now let's talk about the pathing over here, I guess. So we have the Spire of Stone, which I talked about earlier. The reason why all this strength is allocated is literally just to buff this gem, and it's completely worth it, trust me. You can throw it in Path of Building and try it yourself, but just completely worth it. As for the endurance charges, I wanted to get the two easy ones here because we do get Sun's Light, which gets you endurance charges super easily. Each endurance charge is 4% reduced phys damage taken, which is huge to have like 20% reduced phys damage taken on top of the 20% physical damage reduction from the Basalt Flask. It makes you really tanky against Fizz when you really shouldn't be. And it gives you extra resistances when you're in combat, which is nice because if your resistances are kind of low because you're trying to run different things so you can't really get a lot of gear, the endurance charges really help bridge the gap. And also they give life regen. If you notice, you come into this endurance charge through the left side because life regeneration per endurance charge, 0.2% of maximum life. Doesn't seem like a lot, but you have 5 endurance charges. So it's basically like a 1% life regen right here. So it's nothing to really scoff at. And obviously you get more life regen from Sun's Light as well. In terms of the tree, alternate pathing routes and where we're going to go in the future with the tree, you'll see in the Path of Building that I actually have this taken, so down to Purity of Flesh. Then I have Bloodless taken, and then I have Cruel Preparation taken as well. And yeah, that's probably the way I would go on hardcore. This node right here, Explosive Impact, is really tempting, but you kind of have to come up. It just takes a lot of points, and the radius isn't really that much, and the damage is sort of irrelevant. Obviously, in some sense, whenever you're talking about damage, you want to think in terms of like every little piece is helping you, right? Because I could say this node is irrelevant, right? But then I could be like, well, if I don't take these nodes right here, it also wouldn't kill the build or anything like that. So you could pretty much make that argument about any set of nodes in the build. But the reason why I don't like taking this node specifically is because it's probably the lowest damage node out of all of them and doesn't provide much utility because with the way area scales nowadays, with you getting more of it and essentially getting less from it, the 8% additional area of effect is not really that significant. So you're pretty much just getting the raw damage out of here. If you look over here, you get 30% damage with placement speed with 2 really strong nodes behind it. These are weaker nodes, right? 60% damage right here. This is coming off of Elementalist, which also gives you resist. So all these are giving you something else, or they're following very closely in tune with the way your tree is branching out, right? Same thing with Arsonist right here. Arsonist gives you 1% life regen and 24% fire damage. These totem nodes give you totem health, which is the best thing you can get to scale the damage of this. Same thing here, totem health. So overall, it's just kind of like if you were going to drop any damage, this is the weakest damage to drop, and I would just rather have more health. So, yeah. Also, you get 5 to all res from here. Not too much of a big deal, though. I guess if we're talking about a max point build, you can come back and get it at that point, but, you know, a lot of people don't make it to that point, so. More options. If you did want to go like a more damage-oriented route, you could also just get Skittering Runes to amplify your curse effect, and when you come up to get Whispers of Doom, you can also just come up through the curse effect side. That's kind of up to you, but like I said, I just wanted to make this tanky, focus on more health. It's basically going to have around 6,500 health with like 1,300 mana and a ton of life regen, like 900 life regen, so pretty tanky. Then you add the endurance charges, the basalt, just the way the totems do damage and stuff. Another thing I guess I should talk about while we're on variations to the skill tree is Ancestral Bond. So you can get Ancestral Bond. Now, again, I didn't get Ancestral Bond here just because I want to make the build tankier, right? And getting Ancestral Bond is just, it's basically a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-point investment. Now, 2 of these points are sort of dead points because you're coming down to Purity of Flesh anyway, so this intelligence point and this placement speed point are basically dead points. But you do get Totem Life and Totem Damage, so those are both very strong points. And then Ancestral Bond itself it can be thought of as a dead point damage-wise, but it can give you some cool utility. So if you do want to pick that up, something to keep in mind about it is that if you have the ability to run 3 totems, right, then what you can do is you can actually use a decoy totem on bosses. And on some bosses, you may want to do this because bosses are going to be a lot more dangerous now because they have double the health. So you're going to have to keep them entertained in some way. The problem is the late game bosses, I believe, like the super late game guardians, can't be taunted anyways. So that idea kind of goes out of the window for those. And I feel like you're going to have enough damage to kind of monster most of the other bosses anyways. But if for some reason you were lacking on damage or you just didn't feel comfortable, you could run a decoy totem. And taking Ancestral Bond allows you to run a decoy totem, plus your Righteous Fire totem, plus a Scorching Ray totem. Now, if you run the Scorching, so that allows you to run the 3 totems. So that way you get the penetration effect from the Scorching Ray totem, the damage from the Searing Bond totem, and the taunting from the decoy totem. I find that this is not necessary in a lot of cases, though, because bosses already tend to get taunted. Because what happens is you'll have your totems out, and the boss will hit the totem, and if it hits the totem, then it will get reflected on, and it just takes like pretty much once for it to get taunted, and then it's going to continually attack the totem. And as long as it keeps proccing the taunt by the totem, it's just going to continually get chain taunted. So I don't really feel like you need a decoy totem in most cases, but if you really wanted to run a decoy totem and the Scorching Ray totem, you can always do that. Something that I would do, though, with a decoy totem and not having this is I would just run a decoy totem with your Righteous Fire totem. Like if I ever felt a boss was too unsafe, you can always just run a Righteous Fire totem and a decoy totem and forgo the Scorching Ray totem. So it's kind of just depending on what you want to do there. But it's not really wrong to get this. It's just a different kind of playstyle or different choices. In terms of the gems for this build, we already went over the Spire Stone. You obviously want the Self-Flagnation just so that you can get the benefit from your curses. You obviously, like this is a 17. Ideally, you want a 20. Normally, those things wouldn't matter as much, but considering we're gonna have like probably 4 to 8 curses on you at any given time, that 3% kind of adds up. So you want one that's at least over 15%, I would say. Otherwise, you're going to be losing a substantial amount of damage out there. And in terms of the other jewels, you're basically just looking for totem life, maximum life for you, and damage over time, straight damage, fire damage, elemental damage, pretty much anything like that. And obviously, if you need any resist or something, you can get them through jewels quite easily. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that covers all the tree variations. And let's talk about the ascendancy variations, right? So I'll bring up the ascendancy here. Now, the main choices you're going to have, in my opinion, is probably going to be Berserker or Chieftain, right? And there's obviously pros and cons to both. I think the Chieftain, at least for hardcore, far outweighs the Berserker though, because of the basically reduced damage taken. You have to look at it like as you're contrasting both of these ascendancies together, right? So when you look at something like Moon's Presence, you think, okay, so 8 less damage and 16% more damage, right? I'm taking 8% less damage, dealing 16% more damage, but as Berserker, I deal 40% more damage, right? Well, the problem is that as Berserker, you also take 10% more damage. So you're effectively taking 18% less damage by playing Chieftain over Berserker, right? Even though you're dealing like 24% less damage. So just something to keep in mind there. And like on hardcore, 18% damage taken is pretty substantial. Especially the problem is it just gets worse the harder things hit, right? They're already hitting you for a ton, taking a huge chunk out of your max life. And if they do 20% more damage or 18% more damage, you just stand a better chance of being one shot. So, or just getting into a point where you'll get gived by a couple of things very quickly. So you have to really take that into account while playing hardcore. Not to mention, you get more life regen from the Chieftain because all these intermittent nodes here are 0.5% life regen. You get 2% life regen, and basically, what is this like? Okay, so 20% fire damage and some totem placement speed. Totem placement speed is sort of can be undervalued, especially with given the fact that there's a delay on the righteous fire totems before they open up. Because what happens is if you just cast a totem, it's just going to stand there and do nothing. There has to be a mob around, and when the mob around, it activates. So there's a little bit more of a delay than normal, and anything you can do to mitigate that via totem placement speed to just make the transition between putting the totem down and activating quicker, the better, basically, is how I look at it. Obviously, you get the taunt here in some cases, which is good. The totem reflect is actually quite substantial because your totems have a ton of life, so reflecting 8% of their maximum life is pretty huge. The immunity to fire damage is actually really nice, especially in something like Zoff breaches, but even just generally speaking, your totems really don't die that much anyways, though. The good thing about this is that they don't kill themselves, and you're going to have a reasonable amount of duration, so that allows your totems to stay out for long periods of time, which is, again, especially helpful in things like breaches and the like, although in a lot of cases you're going to be leapfrogging them anyways. And speaking about breaches, I'm going to touch on something right after I finish this comparison here. So, yeah, and then we have the Sun's Light. So Sun's Light is obviously just great because you get easy charge generation, and the life regen is not bad, and you're immune to ignite. So I just think overall the Chieftain's a lot better because you get tons of utility with the Chieftain. You get life regen with the Chieftain, less damage taken with the Chieftain. The only side effect is you're doing 24% less damage. And with the Berserker, basically you get no utility and a lot more damage, but a lot more damage taken as well. And then you can get the Warcry node, which is nice because it basically buffs your Warcry duration, and it's especially nice if you run Arcane Surge on it, because running Arcane Surge on it is going to have increased duration. And then if you link that to an increased duration gem, you're going to have a really long-lasting Arcane Surge buff for the mana regen. So that could be nice. And then the fact that they heals you for 25% of your health and 25% of your mana is also nice. But it's just not enough, in my opinion, to really justify getting hit for that much more damage. So to each their own. If you're playing softcore, obviously Berserker's fine. But if you're playing hardcore, I definitely look into playing Chieftain. The breach thing, that's what I want to talk about. So playing breaches, this is another point in time where the other ancestral bond node is kind of where the ancestral bond node is helpful, because having 2 totems or 3 totems instead of 2 is actually quite nice in a breach, because you can just cover more area, right? And it's just generally more safe. You can overlap the totems a bit more if you want and still get a nice spread. And you can just leapfrog the totems more efficiently because you're being protected by 2 totems when you leapfrog to the 3rd. Yeah, it's just better for breaches, but the thing is, I would say that you can survive fine with 2 totems. You just have to play carefully. The main issue you have in breaches is that the totem activation time is kind of like a bit of a pain in the ass. So it's just something you have to be kind of cognizant of. Normally how I like to play breaches is I'll start with the totems down, obviously, and hopefully the elemental overload buff up. The things that, if stuff spawns like right on top of you, you want your totems initially like to have some overlap with you, or you want to be very close to them, and your totems should instantly kill, like kind of like the first wave of stuff that comes in. Then you can kind of like just retreat into a direction where there's not as much stuff, and stuff is going to be kind of like coming to you, so it's going to be going through your totems and dying very quickly. You can throw out Vol Lightning traps just to get some shot ground so stuff dies quicker. And you basically just want to work on stabilizing yourself in the breach and making sure you have a safe spot to work off. And then once you've kind of established a bit of safe zone, you can kind of leapfrog out from that and start taking up ground in the breach and work towards getting the hands and stuff like that. Yeah, typically you don't have to really rush to get the hands because the breach will be open enough time as long as you don't play it super slow, so that so there's just no rush at the start basically. Just get yourself into a position where there's a safe zone and then start building back out from that safe zone. Because trying to like just stay in the middle of the breach, for example, and just battling all directions, you can get a bit sketch because again the totems have that activation time and some of the breaches have a ton of density, so you can really just get overrun quite quickly. So just something to be careful about. And I'm pretty sure that covers it for this build. I think that's pretty much everything. The exhausted list of stuff to cover. Yeah, I think I mentioned too, you can always get, if you can't afford a Doriani's, you can just get a high fire damage scepter. If you can get a high fire damage suffix, or prefix rather, and burning damage suffix, you can actually craft more fire damage as a prefix. So that's always nice, and you'll be able to get something close to Doriani's. But if not, not the end of the world. The build functions with a lot worse gear than this, basically. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. And if you guys have any questions or comments or anything like that, just feel free to leave them in the video, and I will get back to them as soon as possible. So thank you for watching, and hope you enjoyed.